Chapter 1.10.13 API-initiated eviction. Summary. API-initiated eviction uses the eviction API to gracefully terminate pods. Users can request eviction programmatically, respecting pod disruption budgets and grace periods. API handles eviction requests by returning 200 OK or error codes. In 200 OK, pods are marked for deletion and data is updated. Errors are due to budget config or API limits. API-initiated eviction. API-initiated eviction involves using the eviction API to terminate pods gracefully. You can call this API directly or use a client like the _drain command. Evictions adhere to pod disruption budgets and termination grace period seconds. An eviction object is created to trigger the API server to terminate a pod. This is akin to a policy-controlled delete action. The process ensures compliance with configured pod disruption budgets and termination grace periods. _drain is a command example that utilizes the eviction API to request pod evictions programmatically. It respects pod disruption budgets, allowing controlled disruptions by integrating termination grace periods. Calling the eviction API. This JSON code represents an eviction object with the name "ku" in the default namespace. It specifies the API version as policy v1 and the kind as eviction. The code snippet creates an eviction object in the policy v1 beta 1 API version for a pod named "ku" in the default namespace. This object would trigger the graceful termination of the specified pod. This code is using the curl command to send an HTTP POST request to the Kubernetes API server to initiate the eviction of a pod named "ku" in the default namespace. The request includes the eviction configuration details provided in the eviction JSON file as the request body. You can interact with the Kubernetes API through a Kubernetes language client to create an eviction object by using a POST request, as demonstrated using versions policy v1 and policy v1 beta 1. It's important to note that from version 1.22 onward, policy v1 should be used because policy v1 beta 1 is deprecated. When dealing with earlier versions, policy v1 beta 1 is necessary. Alternatively, you can perform an eviction operation by directly accessing the API through commands like curl or wget. This method gives you another way to interact with the Kubernetes API for managing resources effectively, offering more flexibility outside using language clients. How API-initiated eviction works. 1. When an eviction is requested via the API, checks are made. A 200 OK response indicates that eviction is permitted, similar to a delete request, and subsequently, the pod is deleted. 2. A 429 response means eviction is not allowed due to a pod disruption budget or API rate limits. Eviction might be possible later. 3. A 500 error suggests a misconfiguration, like several pod disruption budgets for one pod. 4. If no pod disruption budget exists, eviction is automatically allowed with a 200 response. The pod is then marked for termination in the API server. 5. Once marked, the node's kubelet begins a graceful shutdown and removes pod from control plane objects. 6. After the grace period ends, the kubelet forcefully ends the pod and informs the API server, which then deletes it. Troubleshooting stuck evictions. Applications may become unresponsive with 429 or 500 errors due to issues like repeated pod creation without readiness from replica set or extended termination of the last evicted pod. Investigate an address with careful operation management, manual pod deletion, and pausing automated processes. To address stuck applications, pause or abort the operation causing the problem, investigate the issue, and manually delete the pod if necessary, avoiding the eviction API temporarily. A combination of these actions can resolve pod readiness or eviction errors effectively. The inability of new pods to become ready or prolonged pod termination can disrupt applications, resolved by pausing operations, investigating the root cause, or manually removing stuck pods. This method assists in regaining control when automated systems fail.